Chapter 21 Worrying. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Nikolai, without hesitation, answered Malyshenko's question after a brief pause. Sir, the motorized rifle company took heavy losses. Captain Sergei, the company commander, and Lieutenant Debov, the political officer, are dead. Over 70% of the squads are casualties, and they're basically combat ineffective. Malyshenko, despite bracing himself, was stunned. 70% casualties. The company commander and the political officer. How? He'd never experienced a German air attack before, and he hadn't expected such devastation. But the evidence was all around him, burning vehicles, bodies of Red Army soldiers strewn across the fields. He tried to calculate the total casualties and felt a surge of panic. With such losses, morale aside, their fighting strength was drastically reduced. If they ran into the German vanguard, they'd be slaughtered or captured. And Malyshenko wasn't about to end up in a prison camp, but retreating or holding their ground would be seen as disobeying orders, a potentially fatal offense, though Order No. 270, Stalin's decree threatening families of soldiers who surrendered, hadn't been issued yet. Malyshenko knew the Soviet army was far less forgiving than the Western Allies. He couldn't afford to be a scapegoat for a defeat. Moving forward meant risking capture or death. Retreating meant a possible execution by Commissar Petrov or a military tribunal. He sat on a rock, his mind racing, trying to figure out the least terrible option. Finally, he straightened up, a decision made. Rescue the wounded and recover what supplies we can. Leave a minimal force to transport the wounded to the rear. The rest of us regroup immediately. We have a duty to the Red Army and the people. We can't let these invaders scare us off so easily. We continue to advance as ordered. As he shouted the rallying cry, he was already planning his next move. Survival was his priority. After ordering the remaining troops to advance, Malyshenko pulled Nikolai, the signalman, aside. Nikolai, send a telegram to division headquarters. Report that we suffered heavy casualties from a German air attack. Tell them that despite the difficulties and setbacks, Captain Malyshenko, true to the spirit of the Red Army, is leading his troops forward as ordered, upholding the oath sworn under the military and party flags. Request immediate support from follow-up forces. Nikolai, understanding the situation, nodded and gave Malyshenko a knowing smile. Understood, sir. I'll send the telegram right away. Good. Be quick, and use the exact wording I gave you. Our situation is critical, so every detail matters. Now, go. Watching Nikolai trot away, Malyshenko sighed. He could only hope his superiors wouldn't ignore his message. I hope Petrov and Cherniv don't abandon me. Otherwise, this little captain is done for. About half an hour later, as Malyshenko's command tank, number 177, started moving, a radio wave shot towards the rear. 40 kilometers behind, the Soviet 20th Tank Division was slowly crawling forward, weighed down by heavy equipment and supplies. The endless dirt road, made worse by recent heavy rains, had turned the grassland into a quagmire. Tanks, anti-aircraft guns, towed howitzers, trucks, all struggled in the mud. Some tanks broke down completely, their wheels hopelessly stuck. Maintenance crews, usually with little to do, were working desperately to free the trapped vehicles. Cherniv frowned, frustrated by the slow progress. He was under orders to advance quickly, but the terrain was proving a formidable opponent. Chapter 22 Follow-up Reinforcements. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The mud flew like volcanic lava as the tank's treads churned it. The 20th Tank Division's maintenance crews scrambled to rescue the steel beasts mired in the muck. Division Commander Cherniyev, leading the charge, threw his arms up and bellowed. Back up. Damn it, are you guys brain dead? I told you to reverse. Now you're stuck on the slope, spinning your wheels. You want me to give you a tank driving lesson? Before Cherniyev could finish his rant, Lieutenant Colonel Petrov, the division's political commissar, rushed up, clutching a freshly printed paper that still smelled of ink. Comrade Commander, you need to see this. We just received a telegram from the advance troops. Captain Malyshenko's 2 companies took a beating from a German air raid. He says they're still pushing forward as planned, but he's down to less than 10 tanks and a single infantry platoon. What? A German air raid? Chernihiv snatched the telegram from Petrov, his face a mask of disbelief. He scanned it, his anger building with each word. He crumpled the paper in his fist. Damn it all. German planes are buzzing around like flies, but where's our air force? Where are our damn pilots? It's been almost a week since this war started, and I haven't seen a single one of our planes. Those Air Force commanders deserve a one-way ticket to the Gulag. Petrov sighed, watching his furious partner. Hold on, comrade commander. A friend of mine in the Ministry of Internal Affairs told me that the Germans crippled almost all our frontline air bases, including those of the Southwest Front, on day 1. They caught our planes sitting ducks in the hangars and on the runways. Those poor pilots didn't even have time to get airborne before the Stukas got them. My friend told me to watch out for German air power. Until we get new planes, the sky belongs to them. Chernihiv was stunned. He couldn't believe the Southwest Front's Air Force, supposedly the best in the Soviet Army with nearly 1,000 aircraft, was in such a desperate state. The reality of the German blitzkrieg hit him hard. How could this happen? We're the Southwest Front. Peter, we're the Red Army's powerhouse. How could our planes be destroyed on the ground before they even got off the ground? How are we supposed to deal with those German bombers without air support? I can't accept this. Petrov, seeing Chernihiv on the verge of losing it, understood the blow this news delivered. His face grim, Petrov saw a bleak future. He looked up. The Air Force's mess is for them to sort out. Right now, we need to figure out how to get reinforcements to Captain Malyshenko, ASAP. We also need to get him some anti-aircraft guns to ward off another attack. Chernihiv reined in his emotions, forcing himself back into the mindset of a division commander. He took a deep breath and nodded slowly. You're right, Peter. Even after taking such heavy losses, Malyshenko's still pushing forward. That alone makes him worthy of his rank and a true party member. We have to get him some backup. He's our little hero. Chernihiv's mind raced. Knowing Petrov's nephew, Kirill, was with the advance troops, he understood the Commissar's urgency, but it wasn't just about Petrov. Chernihiv also recognized Malyshenko as a rising star. After careful consideration, he decided to pull Malyshenko from the fire. Here's what we'll do, Peter. I'm sending a company of T-34s from the 1st Tank Regiment to reinforce Malyshenko. We'll also send 6 vehicle-mounted 37mm anti-aircraft guns and 2 76mm anti-aircraft guns, escorted by an infantry company. We'll pick the best equipment we have, load them up with only the essentials and basic ammo, and send them racing to join the advance troops. What do you think? Petrov, relieved that his nephew was getting help, felt a weight lift. Sounds good, Comrade Commander. No objections here. Let's do it. Also, today's the 25th. We expect our vanguard to clash with the Germans tomorrow. Their armored forces are pushing hard toward Lutsk and Brod. We need to be ready to intercept them. Chapter 23 Fierce Battle with Brod, Part 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Lieutenant Colonel Petrov knew the score, the German Army Group South, an unstoppable force mowing down everything in its path, was closing in on the Soviet Southwest Front, to which the 20th Tank Division belonged, to stop Rundstedt's army from reaching Kiev, a crucial city in the southern Soviet Union. General Koponos, Commander-in-Chief of the Southwest Front, massed troops. He pulled together the 9th Mechanized Army under the renowned Rokossovsky, the 19th Mechanized Army, and elite units like the 22nd Army, hoping to halt the German juggernaut. Rundstedt responded in kind, unleashing his top unit, the German 1st Panzer Group, led by General Erwin von Kleist. Dawn was breaking, painting the grasslands gold. Soldiers on both sides, seasoned by war, could practically smell the coming battle, a brutal clash of steel and flesh. Petrov stuck his head out of the tent, glanced at the rising sun, and, sensing the impending carnage, went back inside the division HQ. "Got a telegram," Division Commander Cherniev said. "Rokossovsky wants us to attack the Germans in half an hour, same as planned. We need to hit them before they hit us, seize the initiative." Petrov wasn't surprised. He'd just checked on the troops. "We're almost ready. First wave of tanks and infantry are in position. Artillery's finalizing deployment, ready to fire on schedule." "But," Petrov continued, "how ready are the other units in the 9th Army?" "What about the other armies?" Cherniev, never one to hide things from his old friend, answered directly. "In our 9th Army, the 131st Motorized Infantry Division and the 35th Tank Division are set to attack on our right and center. We're on the left." He hesitated, then admitted, "As for the other armies, well, we've got 5 mechanized corps, including us, lined up from Lutsk to Brod. Our job is to take Brod. The others will operate alongside us, hitting the Germans on adjacent fronts." Cherniev, knowing Petrov had survived the purges and seen terrible things, patted him on the shoulder. "I know what you're worried about, Peter. But relax. We're throwing everything we've got at them, 5 mechanized corps, over 2,000 tanks. We may have lost air superiority for now, but with that kind of firepower and the Red Army's fighting spirit, we can beat these Germans." Petrov, still uneasy, took some comfort in Cherniev's words, but not much. "Look, no, I shouldn't say this as a political commissar, but I'm worried about these new officers, the ones promoted after the purge. Are they up to the job? You and I have been together since the beginning, Cherniev. You know how much impact these inexperienced officers can have on a battle like this." His quiet words weighed heavily. Petrov, loyal to the party, couldn't help but fear for the campaign's outcome. "Frankly, I wish our young officers were all like Captain Malyshenko. He reminds me of what we used to be, dedicated, ruthless, but with a little bit of smarts. That's what the Red Army needs, not just guys who know how to kiss ass to get ahead." Cherniev shook his head, a little stunned. "So, you're a fan of this Malyshenko? Not just because he's helping your nephew, but as a political commissar, as a judge of character, you think he's a good soldier?" Petrov smiled slightly. "To be honest, yes, I admire him." Meanwhile, at the 20th Tank Division's assembly point, the 1st Armored Regiment's 1st Company had arrived. After driving non-stop, they'd finally reached their designated area with the new reinforcements late last night. Exhausted, Malyshenko and his crew hadn't even had time to rest. Under the division's emergency orders, they were already preparing for the attack. Chapter 24 Fierce Battle with Brod, Part 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. There was a flurry of activity at the 1st Tank Company's position, right at the front of the Soviet 20th Tank Division's starting line. The crews had just been ordered to refuel and load up the command T-34, tank number 177. With preparations complete, Malyshenko immediately grabbed his binoculars and scanned the town of Brod in the distance. Just a few kilometers away, this small Ukrainian town had become a German army stronghold. Malyshenko, who'd been traveling non-stop with his troops, hadn't had time to interrogate prisoners or receive detailed intel from above about the number and strength of the German forces stationed there. All he knew was that he had to attack in a few hours and crush those invaders. Even with the low magnification of his binoculars, Malyshenko strained his eyes and managed to make out something of interest. On the outskirts of the town, the Germans, who had enjoyed complete air superiority early in the war, were already aware of the Soviet Southwest Front's movements, thanks to aerial reconnaissance. They'd used this warning to build a network of anti-tank defenses and trenches outside Brod, ready to meet the Soviet offensive. Regardless of how many troops the Germans had in Brod, it was clear that their commander was cautious, which wasn't good news for Malyshenko, who was about to spearhead the attack. "Why can't I catch a break? Are there no pushovers among these Germans? They're all tough nuts to crack. This sucks." Kirill, who was nearby, overheard Malyshenko muttering and asked curiously, "Sir, what do you see?" "Nothing good. Those Germans are forcing civilians to dig fortifications and trenches. The longer it takes, the harder our attack will be. Let's go, pack up, and get ready to roll. Before Malyshenko could finish, a deafening roar ripped through the sky from the rear of the Soviet position, startling soldiers on both sides. Malyshenko was briefly stunned, then realized what the sound meant. He turned to Kirill. Quick, Kirill, back to the tank, let's go. We attack as soon as the bombardment stops. No time to waste, move it. That the thunderous noise was the sound of the 5 Mechanized Corps of the Soviet Southwest Front, gathered from Lutsk to Brod, beginning their artillery barrage before the attack. The Soviet army, believing in artillery supremacy, was pulling out all the stops, even though the 5 Mechanized Corps, rushing to the front, weren't at full strength in terms of heavy artillery and ammo. The combined force still managed to deploy over 800 artillery pieces of various types. Along a narrow front of just tens of kilometers from Lutsk to Brod, including rare, independent artillery units directly under Army command, these Army-level artillery battalions, equipped with 12B for 203 mm heavy howitzers, were the most powerful units in the Soviet field artillery. These massive guns weighed 8 tons each. The design team mounted them on Comintern crawler tractor chassis to improve mobility. With the gun and the track chassis, the total combat weight of the B for 203 mm heavy howitzer reached over 26 tons, about the same as a T-34 tank. This was a huge weight for a howitzer that still needed to be towed. The high cost, manufacturing complexity, and slow maneuverability meant that these giant guns, only found in Army-level artillery battalions, rarely saw frontline action. But now, desperate to stop the German army group south from reaching Kiev, the Soviet troops were pulling out all the stops, including the Army-level artillery battalions. From the A-19 122 mm cannon and ML-20 152 mm howitzer to the deadly B-4 203 mm howitzer, the Soviet army deployed dozens of artillery positions on the narrow front from Lutsk to Brod, and almost all of the 800 guns roared at full strength. The earth-shaking artillery barrage turned the German 1st Armored Group's defensive position into a sea of fire. In the former town hall, which the German troops had turned into their division headquarters just a day before, a middle-aged man wearing the rank of SS group leader in the command room swayed unsteadily and exclaimed, "My God, did those Ivans load Stalin himself into a cannon? Alfred! Give me a situation report, now." Chapter 25 In the name of the head of state. You are listening at novelfull.audio. As the SS group leader, a guy in his 40s, bellowed, a young officer in a crisp black SS uniform burst through the office door. "Incoming from the front, General Dietrich. The Soviets are on the move. They're pounding our outer defenses with everything they've got. Our first-line troops have pulled back to the second line in designated safe zones. Casualties are light so far." Dietrich, the SS man, breathed a sigh of relief at the report. Good. General Kleist was right. These Ivans, their heads full of vodka, always go for the artillery barrage. Predictable. Shouldn't be too hard to handle. Dietrich paced the slightly vibrating office, hands clasped behind his back, deep in thought. Suddenly, as if struck by inspiration, he whirled around. "Alfred, phone the frontline regimental HQ, tell them Ivan will go berserk when the shelling stops. Aerial recon shows they're throwing 5 mechanized armies with over 2,000 tanks at us. The Soviets outnumber us and have better equipment in this sector, so no one gets complacent. Absolutely no unauthorized counterattacks. Is that clear?" The adjutant, clearly taken aback by the harsh order, snapped to attention. "Yes, sir, General. I understand. I'll see it done." As his adjutant hurried out, Dietrich, a grim smile playing on his lips, muttered to himself. "Come on, Ivans. Every drop of your blood will shine on my medals." Neither Malyshenko, heading back to his tank to warm up, nor Division Commander Cherniev at the rear HQ, nor even Major General Rokossovsky at the 9th Mechanized Army headquarters, had any idea that the town of Brod was about to be hit by the entire Soviet 9th Mechanized Army, and was defended by a single division. That division was recognized by later historians as one of the three best elite forces of the German Waffen-SS during World War II, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandard. SS Adolf Hitler Adolf Hitler's bodyguard regiment, named by order of the Führer himself. Its current commander was Joseph Sepp Dietrich, a close confidant of Hitler, and an SS group leader, equivalent to a Wehrmacht lieutenant general. This Adolf Hitler division, the Führer's elite forest guards, from Dietrich on down to the newest recruit, were all fanatical, unwavering followers of Hitler. In previous battles, these SS soldiers, who swore to dedicate their souls and everything to the Führer, fought like madmen. Traditionally, Western armies often surrendered when the situation turned dire. It was hard to find units like the Chinese and Japanese armies, willing to fight to the last man, but that didn't apply to this division, because it bore the name Adolf Hitler. Every officer and soldier in the Führer Guard division had a fierce sense of unit pride and a determination to die rather than surrender. In the two front wars spanning the Eastern and Western fronts, they earned renown with their own blood and the blood of their enemies, fulfilling the oath they swore under the Nazi banner. Regarding the Führer's Guard division's combat performance, General Patton, who faced them in battle, once said, "I hate to admit it, but our boys are just farmers compared to these fanatics. They're more like a professional army." Although Operation Barbarossa had just begun, the division wasn't yet the battle-hardened force it would become after years of experience on both the Eastern and Western fronts. Their command skills at the higher levels were still developing, and it wasn't quite a top-tier unit, but there was no question about the iron will and morale that the fanatical beliefs of its officers and soldiers provided. Regardless of the outcome, for Malyshenko's 9th Mechanized Army, a battle against such fanatical believers, armed with the best weapons and equipment in the world, would be a tough fight. Unaware that his enemy was the SS Elite Guard Division, Malyshenko, back in his tank, quietly waited for the artillery barrage to lift. In addition to the 10 T-34s that Cherniev had earlier approved to bolster Malyshenko's command, political commissar Petrov finally relented and agreed to bolster the spearhead of the division. Cherniev ordered all 4 KV-2 heavy tanks from the 20th Tank Division to Malyshenko's command to crush German resistance with overwhelming firepower. Having studied Soviet and German armor extensively, Malyshenko knew the KV-2, a huge, 52-ton steel beast, very well. Designed to smash enemy fortifications, the KV-2 boasted an M10T 152mm heavy howitzer in an era when German Panzer IVs were still using short-barreled 75mm guns for fire support. Chapter 26 The Divine Religion Goes to War. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The KV-2's massive howitzer was designed to obliterate enemy fortifications and spearhead breakthroughs. You could say it packed a serious punch. Its M10T 152mm howitzer fired a high-explosive shell weighing a staggering 40 kilograms. The warhead alone contained 8 kilograms of TNT, slamming into enemy defenses at 530 meters per second, devastating at close range. The sheer shell weight and explosive force of the KV-2's high-explosive rounds were comparable to modern 155mm self-propelled howitzers. Back in the early days of World War II, when most tanks carried puny 75mm or 76mm guns, the KV-2's 152mm cannon was a real game-changer. Of course, enemy defenses might be reinforced with thick concrete and armor. The KV-2 could also run into heavily armored enemy units. High explosive rounds alone might not cut it against those kinds of targets. To solve this, the KV-2 design team included 2 more shell options, the G530 concrete-piercing projectile and the PB35 armor-piercing projectile. As the name suggests, the G530 was specifically designed to smash through thick concrete. Direct fire tests showed it had exceptional destructive power against military-grade concrete fortifications. The huge 152mm caliber gave this specialized concrete buster outrageous kinetic energy. The 40 kg penetrating warhead contained 5 kg of TNT. It could punch through up to 7 meters of military-grade concrete, and the warhead's explosion could cause secondary damage to fortifications up to 3 meters thick. Overall, it could effectively neutralize a meter-thick concrete wall. The PB-35 was a 152mm capped armor-piercing projectile. This wasn't initially a Soviet Army project. but adapted directly from the Red Navy's 152mm naval gun ammo. Even though the KV-2's M10T howitzer wasn't designed for anti-tank use and had a short barrel, the massive 152mm caliber and the sheer amount of propellant gave it surprising punch. When fired from the KV-2's stubby howitzer, the PB-35 could still penetrate 120mm of homogeneous steel armor at a 90-degree angle from 500 meters. In the early war, before heavy tanks were common, that was enough to instantly destroy anything it hit. Despite its design flaws and limited production run, just over 500 vehicles, some KV-2s survived long enough to face German Tiger and Panther tanks, but even the Tiger's 100mm upper front armor, equivalent to the Panther's 130mm upper front armor, was vulnerable. Against these new German tanks. The KV-2 was still a threat. A well-placed 152mm armor-piercing shell would take them out, no questions asked. Inspired by the KV-2, the Soviets later developed the Su-152 and ISU-152 heavy tank destroyers. These mobile 152mm guns could blast German tanks to pieces, greatly boosting the morale of Red Army soldiers, who nicknamed them Zoo Killers. Soviet tank design before the war emphasized all-around protection. Side armor was as strong as front armor. With this in mind, the KV-2 had 75mm of armor on all sides. The upper hull was sloped at 31 degrees, providing the equivalent of 85mm of protection against a horizontal shot. The turret had a 90mm thick gun mantlet for extra protection where it was most likely to be hit. The KV-2's biggest weakness was mobility. Although it had a powerful 520 horsepower V2 diesel engine, the 52-ton weight meant the engine was overtaxed. Its top speed was just 26 km per hour, earning it the nickname Iron Bastard among Soviet troops. Furthermore, the KV-2's heavy, tall turret made it slow to turn and unstable. It was prone to rolling over on slopes and rough terrain, forcing crews to detour around even small obstacles. While its performance was mixed, the KV-2's reliable protection and firepower made it a valuable asset. Malyshenko was eager to see the 152mm in action, so he was happy to have these beasts in his company. After waiting quietly in his commander's seat for half an hour, the artillery barrage finally subsided. He knew the moment had arrived. Then, he heard Division Commander Chernyev's familiar voice on the radio. "Captain Malyshenko, time to serve the motherland. Begin the attack. Tear those invaders apart and bring honor to our 20th Tank Division." Chapter 27 Confrontation, Part 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Sitting in his commander's seat, Malyshenko heard the expected words. After a moment's thought, he used the radio in his T-34 command tank to call back Cheer Commander Nayev. "I will fulfill my mission, Comrade Commander. You can count on my victory." That before his determined words could even settle, he straightened up and popped open the turret hatch. Holding two signal flags, Malyshenko climbed halfway out of the turret and immediately turned towards the other tanks. He waved the semaphore flags to signal the first armored company to attack. One of the biggest problems for the early Soviet armored forces in the Great Patriotic War was the lack of radios for inter-vehicle communication, a potentially fatal flaw. In the summer of 1941, when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the Soviets only had radios in company command vehicles. Communication between tanks and other friendly units relied on semaphore flags and dispatch riders on motorcycles. It's like the saying goes, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And this was especially true for tanks. So, in the summer of 1941, the Soviet armored forces, still relying on outdated semaphore flags for communication, ran headfirst into German armored forces, fully equipped with radios, battle-hardened, and skilled at coordinated maneuvers. These green Soviet tank crews, despite being equipped with superior tanks like the T-34 and KV series that outclassed German armor, still couldn't land a knockout blow. It was a classic David and Goliath story, where experience trumped raw power. The Germans, despite being at a disadvantage in tank quality, used blitzkrieg tactics to divide and encircle their Soviet counterparts, defeating them piecemeal. This led to the devastating Soviet defeats of 1941. Malyshenko, as a time traveler, knew all too well the fatal problems caused by the Soviets' poor communication. German tank commanders could stay safely inside their tanks, press a button, and talk. Malyshenko, however, had to take incredible risks. He had to open the turret and wave flags to issue orders to his troops during battle. This was a daunting prospect for Malyshenko, who was determined to survive the brutal year of 1941. Seryoza, let's go. Target the German positions, full speed ahead. Nikolai, man the hull machine gun. Mow down any German infantry we see. Kirill, get ready to load. This is your first fight. Don't let nerves get to you. After you load one shell, grab another one and be ready to reload. We're cutting you some slack because you're new, got it? Kirill, his ears ringing from the roar of the T-34's diesel engine, nodded vigorously at Malyshenko. Understood, sir. All right, full speed ahead. Let's tear those damn invaders apart. The driver, Seryoza, expertly shifted gears and floored the accelerator. The 28-ton T-34/76 surged forward, powered by its 500 horsepower engine. The other 15 T-34s and 4 KV-2s of the company moved out alongside it, providing flank cover. Only about half a mile from Malyshenko's position, concealed in a thicket on a hill near the German lines, was a Stu G3 OSV. A assault gun from the SS Leibstandard Division Adolf Hitler, camouflaged with local vegetation. Beside it, a young SS officer, the assault gun commander, lay in the grass, calmly observing the Soviet advance through his binoculars. The recent Soviet artillery barrage hadn't seemed to faze him. After noting the direction and distance of the advancing Soviet armor, he quickly scrambled to his feet and ran back to his vehicle. He jumped into the hatch, and before he even sat down, the gunner turned around impatiently. Hey, Michael, are those Soviet Ivans coming? Whitman slid into the commander's seat, donned his headset, and secured it. He spoke with a casual tone, as if he didn't think much of the Soviets. 16 Soviet T-34s, and 4 heavy tanks with turrets shaped like outhouses. Who knows what size gun those Ivans have stuck on those monsters? I swear, I could see that thing through the binoculars and it looked big enough to swallow Stalin's head. The other 3 crew members chuckled at Whitman's joke. Alright, that's enough jokes, boys. Whitman turned on his microphone, adjusted it, and spoke to his crew, ready for battle. Based on reports from other units and interrogations of prisoners, those T-34s and KV series tanks are tough customers. Our assault guns can't penetrate the sides of those KV heavy tanks, so leave those big outhouse turrets to the 88s. When the fight starts, clink, aim low at the sides of the T-34s. We close to within 500 meters before firing. Everyone ready. Chapter 28 Confrontation, Part 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. He had no idea that a No. 3 A-type assault gun commander named Michel Whitman was setting up an ambush along his route. Malyshenko, having led his troops forward, was now commanding his armored company, pushing them full speed towards the German positions ahead, visible in the distance. He hoped to capitalize on the recent pounding the Germans had taken from the Soviet heavy artillery, breaking through their lines and opening a path for the larger forces following behind. It didn't take long for the armored company, moving at top speed, to race across the open grassland, closing to within 600 meters of the first German defensive line. In his position as gunner and commander, he gripped the wide-angle periscope, scanning the terrain directly ahead. He observed that the first German position, now very close, sat on higher ground, forming a closely knit defensive line outside the town of Brod. This made Malyshenko curse under his breath. Damn it, these Germans really know how to pick a spot. They've built their defenses on high ground near Brod. Smart bastards. For Malyshenko's initial wave of T-34 medium tanks, the elevated German defensive position on the slope was definitely bad news. Why did these elevated positions make Malyshenko so angry? It all came down to the design of the Soviet T-34 itself. The T-34 was the first tank in history to effectively use sloped armor to enhance its protection. Its design and performance were unmatched when it first appeared, reflecting the Soviet emphasis on all-around protection. The T-34's upper hull, its most critical area, used 45 mm thick homogeneous steel armor sloped at 60 degrees. This 60-degree slope gave the upper hull the equivalent of 90 mm of armor protection against shells fired on a level trajectory. The sides and rear of the T-34 used 40 mm of homogeneous steel armor, also sloped at 40 degrees, providing the equivalent of at least 70 mm of armor protection against horizontal fire. The turret followed the same design principle. The cast turret's armor was 40 mm thick on the sides and rear, with angles designed to further enhance its protective value. When the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa in the summer of 1941, their troops were genuinely shocked by the T-34's sloped armor, the PAK-36 37 mm anti-tank gun, which had been so effective in the early blitzkrieg, and the PAK-38 50 mm anti-tank gun, suddenly became useless, barely scratching the T-34's paint. The T-34 made the German armored forces, who had conquered France, in just 7 weeks, look obsolete. Overnight, their tanks became relics of a bygone era. Besides the Flak 36/37 88 mm anti-aircraft gun, the German army's most potent anti-tank weapon at the time, which could penetrate the T-34's armor with armor-piercing rounds, the German army simply had no effective way to combat the Soviet T-34. This reality was a major blow to Hitler, who was then promoting his racist theories about the superiority of the German people. The fact that weapons produced by inferior races were technologically superior to his own army left the German leader sleepless for a week. However, even the T-34's sloped armor wasn't invincible. As the war progressed, the German armored forces, experienced in tank combat and tactical research, identified a critical weakness in the T-34's sloped armor. In theory, the T-34's front armor, 45 mm thick and sloped at 60 degrees, offered up to 90 mm of protection against horizontal fire. But this was only true for shells fired on a level trajectory. As German tank crews and anti-tank gun teams gained combat experience against the T-34, they discovered a seemingly miraculous phenomenon. If anti-tank guns or German tanks were positioned on a hill or slope overlooking the Soviet tanks, German armor-piercing rounds could exploit the high-to-low angle. Instead of flying horizontally, the rounds would strike the T-34 at an angle of 30 degrees or more. This downward trajectory would effectively negate the slope of the T-34's upper armor. As a result, the T-34's sloped armor, normally providing 90 mm of equivalent protection, would be severely weakened, offering little more protection than its actual 45 mm thickness. Chapter 29 Confrontation, Part 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. After discovering that using the high-low ground to target Soviet tanks yielded surprising results, the German army quickly spread the tactic of using terrain to their advantage. Even so, using higher ground against Soviet T-34 tanks was still a temporary fix. The German army was usually on the offensive, while the Soviets, defending their country, were more often on the defensive or launching limited counterattacks. This meant the Soviets, more often than not, had the advantage in choosing the battlefield terrain. The Soviet T-34's superiority in firepower, mobility, and protection significantly hampered the German army's offensive strategy in local armor engagements. Developing a new tank to counter the T-34 became a top priority. A distant well won't quench your thirst. Although Henschel and Porsche were developing new tank designs, this project was still far from completion, leaving the frontline troops in a dire situation. Until the new German tanks arrived, soldiers in the Soviet Union would have to rely on tactics and courage to overcome equipment deficiencies and fight the T-34 and KV series tanks. Let's return to the front line at Brod. The German 1st Panzer Group, in a rare defensive stance, set up a temporary defensive line from Lutsk to Brod. The strongest part of this line was the SS Adolf Hitler Leibstandard Division's defense of Brod. Brod, a border town on the Ukrainian steppes, had a unique and sophisticated design. The Ukrainian steppes were prone to flooding during the rainy season, which made the selection of the town's location very important. To prevent flooding, Brod was built on a slope. This allowed the Soviets, despite their underdeveloped infrastructure, to quickly drain rainwater away from the town, making life more comfortable for the residents during peacetime. However, the engineers who designed Brod never imagined that their design, meant to benefit future generations, would one day provide a strategic advantage to invaders. Relying on Brod's unique location, the SS Adolf Hitler Leibstandard Division deployed multiple defensive positions outside the town, using the terrain to their advantage, from the outermost defensive position, broad, located on a small hill, stood like a pearl on the palm of a giant's hand, the downward slope, nearly 300 meters deep at a 30-degree angle, presented a formidable obstacle for Malyshenko's T-34 tank group. Additionally, the SS troops near Broad could quickly move along the town's roads to resupply, transport the wounded, or reinforce the front lines. Even if the Soviets broke through the outer defenses, the SS could retreat into the town and continue fighting from within the buildings. These defensive advantages, combined with the fanaticism of the Adolf Hitler Guards Division, made them a formidable force. Malyshenko, increasingly somber, silently considered these advantages and whether there were any effective offensive tactics to employ. Suddenly, a burst of fire erupted from the German position, visible more than 500 meters away. Directly ahead, at 1 o'clock, target the lead Soviet T-34 tank. Range is about 510 meters. Adjust density and load armor-piercing rounds. Loading complete. Fire. Boom. Following the gunner's order, the German anti-tank gun team fired a 50 mm Type 39 armor-piercing round at the leading tank. The PAK-38 50 mm anti-tank gun was the German Army's primary frontline anti-tank weapon. This small-caliber gun, with a barrel 60 times its length, had a muzzle velocity of 835 meters per second when firing armor-piercing projectiles, surpassing the Soviet T-34's 76.2 mm F-34 tank gun. The extremely high muzzle velocity gave this light anti-tank gun great armor-piercing capabilities for its time. The Type 39 projectile could penetrate up to 79 mm of vertical homogeneous steel armor at 500 meters. Considering the high-low advantage of the German anti-tank gun positions, this continuous fire was a real threat to Malyshenko's tanks, and a legitimate effort to destroy the T-34s. Chapter 30 Iron Will, Part 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Ding ding. The sound, a heavy thud like a brick hitting steel, echoed in Malyshenko's ears like a monk's chant. He knew his precious ride had just taken a German armor-piercing round to the face, and bounced it. Immediately, he barked orders to the crew. German armor-piercing. Tank or anti-tank gun, right in front. Find it, that the 50 mm Type 39 full-caliber capped armor-piercing projectile flew at a blistering 835 meters per second, over twice the speed of sound. The round had already slammed into the upper part of the tank's nose before the sound of the German gun reached Malyshenko's ears. Caught almost completely off guard, the only thing Malyshenko could register was the dull impact. He couldn't pinpoint the enemy's position from the sound alone. In this situation where they were exposed and the enemy was hidden, he swung around, grabbed the wide-angle periscope, and started scanning the likely trajectory of the shell. Before tanks had modern, high-magnification electronic sights, pretty much every tank from World War II to the early Cold War suffered from a cramped, limited field of view. Back then, with war tech being what it was, tank crews worldwide had a simple solution: the commander, responsible for the whole vehicle, would pop the hatch and stick his upper body out to get a better look at the battlefield. This was common among Allied and German tankers alike. You see tons of old photos of German tank commanders with their torsos hanging out of their vehicles, but, compared to the Allies and Germans, you didn't see many photos of Soviet tank commanders from the early days of the Great Patriotic War doing the same thing. Most pictures of T-34s showed commanders buttoned up tight, looking like they were hiding in an iron coffin. Were the Soviet tank commanders, blessed by the party, just too scared to stick their necks out? Nope. The reason was a design flaw in the early 1941 T-34. As the first tank with sloped armor, the T-34 medium tank made its mark on tank history, but it also had its fair share of shortcomings and design flaws. Take Malyshenko's 1941 T-34/76 medium tank, for example. Its huge, single-piece turret hatch was about as easy to open by hand as doing a full workout at the gym. And to make things even better, the Soviet engineers designed the hatch to swing forward instead of backward like the German tanks of the same era. The official explanation was that the forward opening hatch would act as a shield, offering some protection against small arms fire when the commander was sticking his upper body out. That all sounded good on paper. But once the 1941 T-34s were issued to the front lines, Soviet tankers quickly discovered that when the enormous turret hatch was fully opened during a fight, the commander had to practically stand up straight to see what was in front of him. At that point, he was almost completely exposed, on a battlefield full of artillery. Who knew when a shell would land right next to you? Or if some German ambush unit was waiting to take a shot. The T-34 commander, with his legs and most of his torso sticking out of the turret, was basically a bullseye. And with the T-34 often operating with a crew of just 3, the commander doubling as the gunner, losing the commander usually meant the tank was out of the fight. This flaw meant Soviet tank commanders had to put up with the narrow field of view of their unadvanced optics, and couldn't compensate by sticking their heads out like their German counterparts. It was the worst possible news for Malyshenko, who was currently under attack. After the initial hit, only Malyshenko's command tank had a radio. The rest of the armored company had no way to communicate with each other. He couldn't exactly climb out and wave flags in the middle of a firefight. Frustrated by his unit's lack of communication, Malyshenko could only hope his subordinates weren't completely blind and would spot the enemy before they fired again. Maybe fate was listening to Malyshenko's curses and prayers. As he frantically scanned the German position through his periscope, one of the other T-34s in his company suddenly opened fire. Boom. The gun recoiled as the shell roared towards the German position. A split second later, it exploded in a ball of fire, kicking up dirt everywhere. Reacting instantly, he pointed his periscope in the direction of the blast. Through a gap in the churned earth, Malyshenko caught a glimpse of a slender gun barrel sticking out. Gotcha, you son of a bitch. German anti-tank gun, 1 o'clock. Load high explosive, now.